Now we're going to talk about communicating about the budget. And this is an important opportunity to connect with the community we're working to serve. And oftentimes there's a lot of misunderstandings about the way we use our resources, how much resource we use, and how that's accomplishing what it is the community really wants from us as their city. It's important when we communicate about anything, of course, that we're clear about what the messages are. So around the budget, we want to be clear about who the chief communicators are. Oftentimes it's a chief executive officer, say the mayor or city manager, or somebody they've specifically appointed with that particular role in mind. Again, with the idea not to restrict the access to message, but really more so that we're clear that the message is consistent. And when I interact with one audience, I'm conveying the same message that I'm conveying when I interact with a different audience. So that's oftentimes why it's important to be clear about who's got that responsibility so they can be consistent. Now sometimes that can include council members, maybe a communications person or a department head like a city clerk or a finance director, and that's fine too. But it's important again to make sure that the messages are consistent. We need to communicate with our city staff, both because they're very interested, they're an audience, but also because they often interact with others. And when they do, we are actually having communication occur on behalf of the organization, probably unintentionally, but it certainly does occur through that city staff person. They may be a department director who has a pretty good insight as to what the big picture is, or they may be somebody out in the park mowing the grass and runs into somebody who's got questions about certain things. And so when we communicate internally, we inform that audience, but we also enable them to inform others. So again, being able to do that consistently will certainly help keep clear messages and reinforce with the community that we are working on the same page to try and pursue the things that are important to them. So what are those key messages? I think it's really important to be clear and to keep it simple, keep it boiled down into the few things that we really want people to take away from this particular budget. And oftentimes those are the things that are kind of changing from one time to the next. The routine things that tend to be consistent from budget to budget, they tend to not be as much of a focus area as changes. And we'll talk about some of those in just a moment. There's some things that tend to always come up in these conversations. People want to know, are my taxes going up? And if so, why? What did you think about, what alternatives did you consider? Is there changes in the personnel? Are we going to see staff reductions, for instance? Certainly the internal staff audience is always interested in knowing if there's any staff impacts from the budget. The community tends to be very interested in that as well. So again, that can get kind of complicated, so it's important to be clear about what changes are happening with personnel in a way that all the audiences can understand it in the same way. Also, it's common for the community to want to know about what's happening from a capital project standpoint. Will that new park that's been talked about for years get built this year? Is that new fire station that they've talked about? Or are you shutting down a fire station because of budget constraints? Are you going to have road projects that might affect my neighborhood? So being clear on what the capital projects are is something else to include in your communications sort of key points. I mentioned before keeping the message simple, and I think this is really important. Being an insider, we tend to want to always explain how to build a watch instead of just tell somebody what time it is. I have found myself several times in an explanation when I realized that the person that's asked the question never asked me to go into the level of detail that I've found myself now buried deep in trying to find my way out of. So be careful to keep the message simple. Answer the question that's asked of you. And if you think some additional context, or maybe they didn't understand the issue well enough, ask them if they really meant this particular question instead of the one they posed before you go off and launch into an explanation of what you're sure they were really interested in, only to find again yourself getting tangled up in talking about archaic fund accounting and things that maybe they had no interest in to begin with. Again, things like property taxes can be very complicated, and people want to know, well, why did my tax bill go up when you're saying you only increased 1%, or you didn't increase 1%, or my neighbors went down and mine went up. So you may need to refer these particular kinds of questions to somebody who's got that level of experience with these issues. They can get very complicated, and sometimes these are the opportunities where the answer needs to be a little bit more involved so that you can specifically address the question that somebody's using maybe their tax bill to help pose the question. I mentioned before, be clear about what the key messages are. Maybe even create a cheat sheet that you can share with those that you expect to run into, opportunities to share your story, and make sure that they understand that maybe there's 4 big bullets that we want to convey every time we talk about this budget. Talk about, when you talk about personnel, talk about it again in simple terms. We have a net reduction of 1 because we've added 5 and we've taken eliminated 5 and added 4 to refocus our areas. That's a fairly simple explanation around what could have taken weeks for you to sort out and develop all of the details with respect to. Typically, people are not going to ask you about funds and fund accounting. So again, oftentimes we'll hear a question and we'll interpret it in the context that we live, and that's not really what they're asking. So typically, they're just more interested in things about the overall financial well-being of the organization. Bond rating can be a great way to convey that pretty simply. We're AA rated, and AA is the second to the highest possible rating. And that's a fairly simple message that conveys a pretty clear answer to that question. And with the changes in the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, that they implemented this year, in their statement number 54, a lot of stuff is moving around in our budgets, and it may be worth your time being familiar with what that is, because it may change the way you see the data, and it may end up being a point of confusion otherwise. So that's one thing you may want to think about for yourself so that you understand it well. Again, probably your audiences are not going to be too concerned about GASB Statement 54, but they want to make sure that you know what you're doing, and that's important for you to have an understanding of that. So you can say, the reason my general fund budget went up significantly this year was because of some accounting changes, not because we have expanded expenditures that much. Be sure to check in on who you're communicating with. Which audience is it that you're dealing with, and what kind of messages are they looking for from you? Externally, you've got residents, and they've got kind of one perspective. They live in town, and they live in a certain neighborhood, and they maybe associate more directly with a neighborhood itself, or maybe a school, or whatever. That's their perspective. And yet your business may not be in town, and the business may have a very different kind of interest. And so maybe you find yourself tailoring the message a bit to the different kinds of interest groups that you're dealing with. And I've mentioned staff and internal. It's important that the leadership of the city is all on the same page in terms of what the key messages are. So to the extent you can manage that, it's important to be clear about it. So again, you reinforce consistently with the community and create confidence that on the part of your community that you as an organization are working well together and are moving in a certain direction. And so that can be accomplished by working with the leadership, be it the council and the staff leadership of the organization, to talk about what those messages are. And then internally with staff, we've mentioned already, it's important to make sure that the staff is familiar with what's going to happen. Now, there's certain communications that are required, and public hearings are a required part of adopting a budget. In fact, the RCWs cited on your screen talk about where those requirements exist. And it's interesting because the language can be kind of confusing. The mayor's budget or manager's budget is known as a preliminary budget, and RCW calls it a preliminary budget, and it's provided to the council. And once the council has it, they can begin doing workshops around it, and by virtue of the calendar at the end of November, that becomes known by the RCWs as the final budget. Now, that really has no impact on what ends up being in a adopted budget, but the RCW says there will be a hearing on the preliminary budget and a hearing on the final budget. And again, so that'll be something you'll want to put in your calendar and make sure you abide by those dates. Also keep in mind you're required to have a hearing on your property taxes as well. So it makes a lot of sense just to combine that property tax hearing with one of these two and cover both of those requirements at the same hearing. Lastly, the budget needs to be adopted before the end of the fiscal year, again an RCW requirement. And it needs to be adopted in a balanced manner where you have estimates of your revenues that are at least equal to, along with fund balances or cash balances, to what you're appropriating through your expenditures. So budget adoption is something to keep in mind that needs to be a formal action through an ordinance of the City Council. Once the budget is adopted, that's really the beginning then of the implementation. And this can sometimes be overlooked. And so you want to be careful that in your organization, if you've included certain changes in your budget, that those changes are initiated. It's interesting how often that we can spend a lot of time thinking about what changes should occur, adopt those changes in the budget, adopt the budget, then don't communicate through the organization operationally how things should be adjusted, either staff allocations to different budget accounts or things of that nature. And so it's important to follow through on that and make sure that the contracts that were authorized, say, by that budget are initiated, and things of that nature are really next steps with respect to budget implementation. And we've mentioned a couple of times how important it is to monitor the results both financially and non-financially. Revenues, are they occurring as we expected when we estimated them? Are expenditures in line? And the RCW requires a quarterly report of a financial nature, but in this economy, we certainly recommended more often than that, probably monthly, with at least a subset of the council, maybe a finance committee, to make sure that everybody's comfortable that these budget estimates are on track. And then you have the non-financial, where you're doing some performance measurement analysis and making sure that you are accomplishing what you set out to do when you put this whole budget together, that indeed your plan is performing as you expected.